I think that's super important, and that's like a lifelong journey, to be honest, is just always reading, finding people's perspectives on things, challenging their perspectives on things, and like challenging your own perspective on things as well.
Hello and welcome to Graduate Theory. My guest today is an investment analyst at Folklore Ventures. And out of hours, he's a co-founder of Web3 group called DAO Under. He's the co-founder of Brown Baddies, which is an NFT collection representing South Asian women in the metaverse. And he's also a writer at Superfluid, which is his tech newsletter focused on Web3 and deep tech. Please welcome to the show, Abhi Maran.
Thanks, James.
Thanks so much for coming on the show today, man. I'm excited to dive into your experience through university after university and all this different interesting stuff that you're working on outside of work. But I'd love to start with your university experience and kind of, you mentioned a story to me before we spoke about kind of your thoughts as you were going through university. Kind of what did you study when you first started going to uni, and then kind of what was your process as you went through your degree?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's an absolute privilege to be on your podcast. Massive fan of your work, and really awesome to see what you'll do in the future, and hopefully I can play a small part in that. But yeah, I started uni back in 2015. So I started off studying a Bachelor of Actuarial Studies. Did that for a couple of years, and honestly was pretty bored by it. It was like pretty stats heavy, and like even though I really loved maths, it just sort of like always felt like an arm's length away from like practical applications. And so I ended up just dropping that and sticking with my applied finance degree, and ended up graduating mid 2018. Whilst I was at uni, I ran like a small tutoring company, was president of a student society, and did like a few leadership things here and there, but always sort of had like an entrepreneurial itch, even from when I was like a kid. So I did like the paper run when I was like 10 or something like that, and saved up and invested that money into Macquarie Group shares. And so like always into investing and like starting random side businesses and that sort of. And so straight after uni, I really wanted to get into startups, but at the time, to be honest with you, and this is like mid 2018, so not too long ago, but the startup ecosystem in Australia was like pretty underdeveloped from like a entry role perspective. Like I think there were like seniorish roles, or like roles for people who had been in the ecosystem for like a couple of years, but from like just people pure straight out of uni, I felt it was harder to get in. And so I ended up going down the corporate route for a couple of years, working for a company called Cambridge Associates. And so there I effectively just worked with institutional investors, so like super funds, family offices, endowments, foundations, to structure their investment portfolios. So these are portfolios with about, anywhere from 100 million to about 2-3 billion in AUM. And so it was just investing those assets across all asset classes. And so whilst I was there, got to know a lot more about the funds management industry and asset management as a whole. And so one of my favorite things in that role was just meeting different fund managers and meeting people, and understanding how they see the world, and especially the VC ones were always interesting. And so that's actually where I met my boss at the moment, Alistair Coleman. And so he came to Cambridge one day when I just started. Actually, it was like really, and he came and pitched. Tempest Partners was the fund name before Folklore, and so really liked what he had to say then. But unfortunately, like we didn't invest in the fund at the time, and that's like one of the things that I didn't really like about that role, was like we'd meet a lot of people but not make a lot of investments. And these were people doing like some really interesting strategies, but the problem there is like if you try something new, then you're almost penalized if it doesn't work out. It was just like a mindset that I didn't really appreciate. I'm just coming from like an entrepreneurial background, or just even mindset really. And so did that for 2.5 years. And then at the start of 2021, I was just like really disillusioned with it, and ended up and so just before I quit, I spoke to about 30 startup founders just to sort of see if they had a role, because I saw the startup ecosystem was a lot more developed now, a lot easier to get into. And so just sort of took that route. But before I did that, I actually had an interview with Folklore for an investment associate role. And the feedback from that interview was like, you're really enthusiastic about this stuff. You understand what VC is, but you don't have startup experience. So figure out a way to get that, and we'd love to sort of have you as part of the Folklore team. And so that sort of like spurred me to go and meet these startup founders and talk to them and understand like what I could potentially do for them. So I talked to 30 people. Few were just sort of like me reaching out and understanding like where I might play in the ecosystem broadly, and then a couple were sort of like very targeted in terms of like, oh, I really want to work for this company. And so one of those was a company called Upstreet, which is an early stage fintech business based in Sydney. And so what they do is it's kind of like cash rewards, but instead of getting cash back every time you purchase something, you get shares in the business that you purchase with. So, for example, if you buy something at Woolies, you get X% of your order back in Woolies stock, which is, I think, a pretty novel way of sort of getting on the investing ladder, and it helps people become more financially literate, which is something that's, like, I think pretty close to my heart in terms of helping people do that. I think it's really
Mm.
important to be in control of your finances, and this is like one way that I saw could that could do it. And so worked there in like a pretty wide-ranging role. So did anything from product to B2B sales and everything in between. And so I was there for about 5 months. But during that time, the Folklore team reached out and said, "Hey, we've got like a more entry level role into VC if you'd be keen." And so that was the investment analyst position. And sort of I just sort of jumped at that, since working in VC was the larger goal for a while. But yeah, that was like joined the team mid June 2021, and so I've been a part of Folklore for about 10 months. We're an early stage VC investor investing for the long run. We've got a team of about 18 people, 8 of them investors, 10 operators, and so we really love to partner with businesses early and partner with them for the long run. So supporting them with whatever they need, really. So we've got a portfolio of about 18 companies now, and looking to deploy our third fund, which is, yeah, like pretty exciting times. So we've made a fair few investments out of that recently, and so I've been involved in that process, and it's been an awesome start to my career in VC, I guess. Yeah, that's where we are today.
Yeah, cool. Cool. Yeah, that's a pretty extensive background on yourself. It's nice to hear, like, it's good to hear all that different stuff about you. I've got a lot of questions about yeah, what you do and things like that. I mean, some are just sort of like, well, we'll start off kind of randomly, but just around the
Sure.
VC space generally. I have a
Yeah.
few questions. So
Mhm.
some of them, you kind of, I was going to ask, what differentiates some of the VC funds, and you kind of answered that a little bit, and yours is more like really early stage for the long run. I mean, what are some alternative strategies that like a VC company might have?
Yeah, so there are a fair few different strategies that people employ. So for us, like we like to partner really early on, sometimes at ideation stage, and really support entrepreneurs in their goal. Other people like to play in the later stages, so maybe Series B onwards. And so what they do, they're more maybe later stage investors slash growth equity investors, and so they've probably got bigger fund sizes, can deploy a lot more capital, but more risk averse, and so don't play in the early stages where it's a lot more riskier. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is sort of like spreading your bets really wide and investing in a lot of startups. So like I said, we've got 18 companies in our portfolio. Our funds tend to be fairly concentrated, but we take pretty hefty bets in all of our companies, and so we have high conviction these are the right companies to back. Other funds might
Mm.
spread their bets, invest in 30 to 50 to maybe 100 companies in their portfolios, and so those funds sort of go for an optionality strategy. So do a small investment at the start and then try and follow on in subsequent rounds to maintain their ownership stake or scale it up as the startup starts hitting milestones and things like that. And then some funds are just like pure investment funds, and so we'll just have investors in their team. Others like Folklore will have more of a service model, and we'll have like a large ops team to support the startups. So, for example, we've got a head of people and culture, so she helps our early stage startups, sort of their HR systems and programs and that
Mm.
sort of thing, whilst also looking after our internal ones as well. But it's just like a nice value add that we can sort of give to our startups. We've also got like a financial controller, head of growth, community and marketing associate, head of PR. So like we've got a fair few number of people who are all really talented in their individual fields, who are literally there to help support our portfolio companies in whatever they need, as well as internal, but largely for portfolio companies.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that about VC companies and kind of, yeah, that even that ops side of things. Yeah, I thought it was mostly just the just like
investing.
invest and run kind of thing.
Yeah,
But no, that's good to
yeah.
hear that there's
I
that collaboration as well.
Yeah, it's like an interesting shift that's happening in VC now is to sort of like pursue this full service model. So, like, I think for people who aren't of an investing background, you should definitely consider like the other parts of VC to look into. That might be interesting. It's sort of like semi sort of consulting style, I guess, because you're working with different portfolio companies, but you also have like your main company to sort of support as well. And so I think it's like an interesting like those are all really interesting roles where you get a bit of variety, but also a lot of stability that you might not find at a startup that's like continually growing.
Mm.
But yeah, like those are all like really amazing roles, and they are all like super high impact as well.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And you mentioned there that like when you were applying for this position you're in now, they kind of said, hey, you don't have startup experience that would be really helpful in doing this. Do
Yeah.
you think now that you have that, can you see the difference between sort of not, like someone that perhaps wouldn't have that experience versus having it now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and so there's a bit of debate around this in terms of like whether you're a better investor if you've had that experience, or whether you're a better investor if you haven't. And like I really don't know the right answer, but for me, like having that experience at Upstreet has really helped. One from like an empathy perspective, so like I can understand the struggles that an early stage founder would be going through, but also too just being able to sort of see like the product management approaches that were taken, like the B2B sales side, like these sorts of like little tidbits or insights really help when sort of making decisions on whether you should back a company. So for example, like at Upstreet, some of the sales cycles were like really long, and we were dealing with like large companies to come onto the platform. And so what that sort of taught me, like it really gave me firsthand experience that, dealing with these large companies is like an uphill battle for a startup. Like they're not going to be willing to sort
Mm.
of just like, sign the contract and then help you do whatever you want. You're going to have to sell to them for like 3, 4, 5 months, and it's going to be like a pretty arduous battle to get them over the line. But when you do, like it's a really good thing. But to get there is like really tough. And so like, when portfolio companies undergo that same struggle, then like I can say, hey, like you can do this, you can do that, like try this sort of approach. Or even when I'm looking at a new company, then it's like easier for me to understand what are the uncertainties with their business, like who is their core customer persona, and like what would the sales cycles look like there. And so there's like a few like little insights and tidbits that working at a startup sort of like gave me an insight into, and so like it's helped me analyze other businesses, and then also like help our own portfolio companies or anyone really in the like we
Mm.
do office hours. People sort of come up and say, hey, like I'm really struggling with this, and they're not portfolio companies, they're just founders out in the wild, and we just like to help wherever possible. And so it's like come in handy there like a fair few times. It's kind of surprising, but yeah, it was a good experience for me to go through.
Great, yeah, that's good to hear that it was well worth it, and yeah, good to hear that you got some application out of it. I'm curious to like kind of extend that question and then say, that was a really great experience. Like, what other traits and skills perhaps do you think would really benefit, or like someone going into VC in these kinds of roles, like kind of would be nice to have or essential perhaps?
Yeah. So I think what people don't realize is that being a VC is kind of like a sales role. You're like prospecting for companies, you're nurturing leads. Like it's very sales focused. Like you have to sell the firm that you're working at. So like I have to sort of like, whenever I'm talking to founders, like we sort of like sell ourselves as like really good investors. And my sales pitch is like pretty similar to what I said before. Like we've got 18 staff, like we love partnering with companies like really early on. And so like that's my pitch to founders. And I think that's like a pretty compelling offering, but you sort of have to like talk to a lot of people. Not everyone will want that. And so it's like talking to a lot of people. And so, like I think people in sales roles, like would probably do pretty well in VC if you've got a bit of investing knowledge or nous. That definitely helps. So I think that's one thing that people probably miss out being in VC, and especially if you're not at one of the brand name VCs, then it's even harder to sort of get people to come and take your money. And so like being a
Mm.
really good salesperson is super important. I think another thing that people don't necessarily think of is probably just like building like a public presence or being like super accessible for people to like come up to you and ask you for help. you have to be really accessible to people. And I was like, oh, what does that mean? And he's like, well, you've got to have a public presence. You've got to like write in public. You've got to tweet. You've got to like talk to people, like just be at events and things like that. And so like it can get a bit overwhelming if you're like a private person. Like I was a pretty private person before all of this, but I've sort of had to push that away and like embrace being in public and being like super accessible for literally anyone to sort of get in contact with me and ask me stuff, or like, pick my brain about something, or even just approach me to like, brainstorm stuff. Like being accessible is super important as a VC, and you want to be as open in the ecosystem as possible. And so I think that's something that can be done without being a VC as well. Like you can talk to on LinkedIn, on Twitter, wherever it is, right? You can go to events, you can build your own name in the ecosystem. And I think that's something that people can get started with literally today if they go to the next event, or even if they start tweeting about stuff, to be honest. Like that's a really easy, low barrier way to get into the startup ecosystem. And then I think besides that, maybe more on the investing side is just constructing your own investment thesis, and sort of like thinking critically about companies, either ones that have raised, haven't raised. Like, I mean, you do your own digging, like use Crunchbase to sort of like find up and coming startups in Australia and think about, like what's going good for this business, where this business could go, and like where could it fail. And it's even better if you sort of like DM the founder and just be like, hey, I'd really love to chat about your business for 30 minutes. And then you get the first-hand input, and then you can construct your own sort of investment memo. And it's even better if you publish that publicly. Like if you've got like a pretty robust memo, like publish that publicly, and that's like the start of your content journey as well. So like I think those are a few different things that people could sort of implement today and get started if they're interested in becoming an analyst at a VC fund.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's good to hear that that there's plenty of things that you can do,
Yeah.
to get involved. Whether it's like you said, content creation, Twitter, like events, all this kind of stuff. Like you can get quite involved by
Yeah.
the sounds without having to actually be involved. If
Exactly.
that makes sense.
Yeah, but the thing there is like there's a lot of things to do. So pick the ones that you
Mm.
like doing, because that's what'll stick over time. Like if you really like people, and if you really like meeting people, that's like the best thing you could do. Just go out there, go to networking events, just go and talk to people, be in places where founders congregate, and just get to know them. Like
Mm.
from a personal level to maybe a business level, I don't know. Best thing you could do is like just get to know these people. Yeah, like you shouldn't feel intimidated at all. But yeah, just like
Mm.
pick something that comes naturally to you and just do it. Is my
Yeah.
advice usually.
Yeah. Great. That's good. That should be easy for people to do. Hopefully, how do you think about like upskilling yourself in this environment? Like, what kind of things are you like? There's all these skills that you need and skills that you have already. Kind of, what are some things that you're like, hey, I really want to improve in this particular thing? And then, how do you like? What is your method for doing that? Like, is it just get experience and do it that way, or are you like seeking external things to kind of do that as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And like I sort of said, VC has like different verticals to your skill set, I guess. Like there's like the community building side, there's like the public facing side, there's also like the investment thinking side, I guess. And so like if I think
Mm.
about it in that perspective, like for thinking about investments, what like I really love reading other people's writings, and sort of like picking out the mental models there and like trying to apply that to the companies that I meet. I think that's super important, and that's like a lifelong journey, to be honest. Is just always reading, finding people's perspectives on things, challenging their perspectives on things, and like challenging your own perspective on things as well. I think that's super important. On like the public presence side, I think a lot of it is just like doing and trialing things out. So to be honest, like I always wanted to write like a blog, and I did a lot of it. I did a lot of writing for my tutoring startup back at uni. Like I wrote blogs about HSC topics and that sort of thing. But this
Mm.
was like a different style of writing. This is sort of like my opinion on something. And so with super fluid, what I sort of do is try to like unpack like complicated things. And so like naturally it's sort of got like a Web3 tilt because that's like a really big interest of mine. But there's also like some deep tech stuff. And deep tech is something that I'm like super new to, but I find really, really fascinating. And so I try to sort of break down some of these really cool deep tech topics into digestible pieces for people. And so that's like me, one, learning about something new, which sort of
Mm.
fits in the investment column, but also two, writing about it, getting better clarity of thought, and then also like building a public presence. And then on like the community side, it's like me helping other founders with whatever they need, or like connecting different people to each other, just being present and accessible. And so like that's something that I'm also like improving upon. Like how do I deliver feedback, or how can I get better at like giving advice, or like where can I learn about something that would help someone else. Like that's also like a continuous journey. A lot of it is like in reading and
Mm.
doing, I would say, but you also need to like talk to people, get their perspectives on things. So like there isn't like some like course, I guess, that you could do, unless you did one for
Yeah.
like, let's say if you wanted to be a better writer, you could do a course on that. Or if you wanted to get better at Twitter, I guess there's like courses for that sort of thing. But a lot
Hmm.
of it is like self-driven, just like a lot of reading, a lot of just thinking. Like I'll just like sit there and think about stuff like, where could this possibly go, or like what sort of logically makes sense in terms of like next steps for this industry, like where the tailwinds are, like just doing research like that, I guess, and just thinking about it.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and like I'm curious now. Like, deep tech. Obviously, like Web3 is. It's like people are kind of across what that is.
Mhm.
What is this deep tech? This is like the first one I've heard about it, and like
Yeah,
how is it different? Or how does it connect into that stuff?
yeah. So like deep tech is literally anything that's like really scientific or like advanced. And I think at face value, people sort of get like turned off by it if they're not like scientific themselves, or not like really curious. But it's actually really interesting. So a few like deep tech topics that I've written about in the past was one about longevity tech, which is like very biomedical specific stuff. So like effectively, what are the technologies that are pushing people to live and healthier lives? And so that was like a really
Mm.
interesting deep dive. Another one was just like about space tech and like what's sort of happening there. So there's more to space than just sort of like sending rockets up into space to the moon or to Mars or whatever it is, right? So there's like different
Mm.
satellites there. There's like a whole bunch of stuff that's sort of like intricate in that sort of realm. And then another one that I've written about is this thing called metamaterials. And they're effectively just like taking existing materials that exist today, putting them in unique structures, and then that gives that like end product like unique sort of properties. And so it's just like different things like that, which like sometimes hard to believe, but people are attempting it, and it's something that's like really interesting to me as someone who's like really curious about this stuff. Like it's like
Mm.
fascinating to read about all
Yeah.
of this. Like it's a bit like magic, I guess. But I think people get turned off by like the deep tech moniker because it just sounds hard to understand, and so like people just sort of shut off. But for me, that's like when I start to like get more interested in it, to be honest.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And I'm curious to know too. These kinds of trends that come up. Where are places that you go to kind of have your finger on the pulse of kind of the trending technologies, kind of where the world's going?
Yeah, it's a good one. Honestly, it's like reading other people's Substacks. It's like listening to podcasts. It's reading news articles. So, like the meta materials, for example, like where I found that was listening to another podcast which featured one of the founders of Lux Capital, which is a deep tech VC over in the US. So his name's Josh Wolf, and he's like an incredibly clear thinker, really good at explaining complex concepts. And so he was like talking about meta materials and like in a really brief like two-liner. And I was like, damn, that sounds like super interesting. Let me do a deep dive into that because I reckon 99% of people don't even know what this thing is. So I may as well write about it. One, from my
Mm.
perspective, I'm learning about it, but then two, I can educate other people about it. And so like that specific article, like quite a few people have like come up to me and said like, oh, that was like super interesting. I had no clue that this existed, which is cool as a writer, like for people to do that.
Mm.
But also like it just, yeah, for me, like if I learn about something, that's always like really good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's super cool. And kind of, what would you say to someone that's thinking about doing something like that? Being more public in the environment, posting things that they're learning about, reading about. Kind of, I was like that back in the day. Where I was kind of on the fence, like this is
Yeah.
like risky in some sense. Like people are gonna like, I'm gonna have to like really put myself out there to do this. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
what would your advice be? What would you say to someone that's in that position?
yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, like I was like semi intimidated by it, but the fact that I'd done it before sort of helped. And back then it was like in the context of building a business, which is like completely different. And in this case, I'm like giving my opinion about things. And like, to be honest with you, like 99% of the reception has been like super, super positive. Like, I doubt people are going to call you out on LinkedIn, if on like your opinion or something like that. They might just do like a friendly
Mm.
debate or whatever it is, or like pose a question, but they're not going to be like, you're stupid or you're wrong, blah blah blah. I have actually had negative feedback for one of my articles, which I think was like because I clickbaited it a little, and it was like just like a piece on like whether 10-minute grocery delivery services were sustainable and whether they were actually like good for the workers and that sort of thing. And so
Mm.
like, I don't know, some people had like really biased views on that. And so, it just opens up a can of worms and a nice, healthy debate. But to be honest with you, like, I think a lot of people are just like happy to read what you put out, like happy to learn alongside you. And I think like the worst thing to do is sort of like obsess over the views. I think those are always a nice to have. But I think the best part about it is like if you can get something out of writing that article, like that's great. Like for the
Mm.
longevity tech one, I learned a lot about longevity tech. I was able to sort of distill it into like, a couple thousand words. And that was like me fleshing out like, I guess, like a market landscape sort of piece where it was kind of like, okay, these are like the different parts of the value chain. These are some interesting companies in that, like. And so now like if I come across a longevity tech company, I can sort of like go back to my article, look at what I was reading before, look at if there were competitors in the space or if these guys are doing something interesting. I'm able to sort of like come up to speed with what they're doing a lot quicker. Like it helps from that perspective, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah.
So like
Yeah, definitely.
I always say like do things that you like doing. So if you really like writing about or talking about something, then just do that because it'll make it easier to stick to that sort of consistent schedule, and
Mm.
you're more likely to sort of follow it through.
Yeah. No, I agree with that absolutely. I think that's it. That's really important. One of the things that you're really into as well is obviously Web3, and it's a space that, like we are saying, trending tech. Obviously,
Yeah.
Web3 is kind of if like one of the main trigger points of this space, or one of the main things that's going on,
Yeah.
and it's something that you're involved with as well through things that you're doing outside of work. DAO Under. I'd love to hear more about kind of how the sort of origin story, and then even more about kind of what it actually is, and kind of what you sort of see it growing into in the future.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, so DAO Under literally started off as like me and my friend Jack. We were just chatting about crypto and Web3 and that sort of thing, and we were kind of like, oh, like it'd be awesome to do this with more people. And so we sort of reached out to 10 people that we thought would be interested. They all sort of said yes. And so we just joined this group where like every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. would just talk about this stuff for like an hour, 2 hours, something like that. And so we started this back in November last year, and then that sort of snowballed, and like people would invite their friends or friends of friends and things like that. And so we grew that group to about 50 people or so, and it was like crazy, like so we were on Slack back then, and so we got to like there's like a Slack limit of like 10,000 messages, got to that in like 2 weeks time. Like it was kind of nuts. We had like 80% weekly active users or something crazy. And so like that was really awesome. And so like over Christmas, what we were thinking about was like, okay, how do we sort of scale this up beyond just our friend group or like our like close close circles, I guess. And so that's sort of where DAO Under was born, was sort of like APAC's first Web3 community where, new entrants, builders, participants can all sort of congregate and learn from each other and build together. And so like why this sort of came up was just because like all the people in our initial group was kind of like, this is amazing because everything happens in our time zone. So we sort of like, and this is something that I've
Mm.
seen for a long time, but it didn't like fully click that this was like a huge pain point until a lot of people sort of said it to me. Was like everything in Web3 or crypto usually happens in the US or in Europe. So it's always at like 3 a.m. our time, like different calls or different events, always in the US. And so like Australia and APAC more broadly is just always left out. And so we were like, okay, how do we bring that experience here in our time zone where we don't have to
Mm.
sacrifice our sleep to get involved in this sort of stuff? Like, how can we sort of like help each other build our own projects and that sort of thing without having to go over there to the US to build? And so that's effectively what we're doing. And so we've sort of like deployed 3 or 4 projects, building a couple more at the moment, like incubating them. Sorry. Effectively, what that means is like cross-pollinating teams with different talent. Like if an artist needs engineering talent, helping them there. If like a dev needs artist talent, helping them there. And so we're just sort of like building this like community from the ground up. And so we've got about 250 people or 260 people actually, I think, in the community, and we've got like 350 on our wait list. And so we've like intentionally gated it for now, but we're hoping to open it up more broadly later on. But yeah, that's sort of
Yeah, cool.
where we're at today. Where we want to go is a bigger vision, and so at the end of the year, we want to be able to deliver a 4-day conference called ETH Down Under, where 2 days are sort of like panel speakers or like just sort of builders talking about their projects, showcasing their projects, that sort of thing, and then 2 days of hackathons, and so sort of bring that hacker style Silicon Valley sort of to Sydney, and so
Mm,
that's sort of the goal. It's a big vision, but I think we have the team and the right resources to sort of get it done. So that's the goal there.
yeah,
Yeah.
cool. It's exciting. Certainly. Where do you see? So the DAO is like this decentralized autonomous organization idea. Like, where do you see the actual that side of things coming in and joining the kind of community aspect?
Yeah, so we've already sort of kickstarted that. So within our community, we've got this thing called pods. So we've got an art pod, research pod, design pod, developer pod, marketing pod, and a community pod. And so all six of these pods, what we've sort of done is like instituted pod leaders that sort of put their hand up, and effectively what the pod leaders are going to do, or what they've already started doing, is sort of like getting people who are interested in those little like segments working on something. So for example, where like we've sort of let the design pod sort of like take over our initial design effort. So in terms of like branding guidelines, our logo, like what our collateral should look like, what our merch should look like, they're sort of in charge of that now. So we've like handed away control of that to them, and it's sort of on them to sort of like work away on it. And so that's like the first step to decentralization. Like me and my core team are sort of like built this thing, but like how do we sort of disperse like duties or tasks to like other people to sort of like let them run
Mm,
with it and let the community build what they actually want. And so they're sort of doing that. We've got our developer pods working on like a decentralized jobs protocol and things like that. And so these are just ideas that have like come out from the community as well. So we've got like a long list. Like our research pod wants to sort of start writing more about GameFi and different sort of like advances in the space. And so we've sort of given them like, like the ability to go away and do that. We've enabled them to do that, like, by providing them the resources or connections wherever possible to go away and do
mm,
that. And so, that's sort of how we sort of make this a bit more decentralized than it is now. I think some sort of centralization is not like, otherwise nothing will likely get done. What we've sort of seen with other DAOs in the space is like either they're not really that organized, or that it's sort of lacking like a larger vision. And so like I think there is always going to be like a central nucleus, but what we're hoping is like we can get the community's input into all of that, and as much as possible we will hand over to the community, and then just sort of like build together with them is sort of the goal.
yeah,
But I think it's something that we're still fleshing out. Like, what is the right balance of decentralized versus centralized is like a big debate in my eyes. And so, like, I don't know what the right answer is, but it's something that we're very conscious of and want to sort of, yeah, do in a distributed fashion for sure.
yeah. Cool. It's exciting, certainly. And what advice? I mean, let's say someone is just kind of discovering Web3. There's all these different community things like yours, and there are many others across the world. What are some like if you had to kind of restart in Web3, where would be where would be sort of some places or some things that you would really like to kind of upskill yourself in this area as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so there's a really good guide from, I think it's like another DAO called Crypto Culture Society, and so they've got like an intro to Web3 guide. I think that's really good. But if we were sort of picking away at one of the verticals that Web3 is like split into, so if you think about it from like a vertical perspective, so there's like NFTs, DeFi, normal tokens as like three main verticals, and maybe GameFi as like a fourth vertical, but that's sort of like under NFTs. Um, NFTs
Mm,
might be the easiest one for people to wrap their heads around, just because it seems a bit more tangible than than the others. I think that's an easy one. Or DeFi might be another easy one if you go through apps like Josh Reyes's Minky app, which I think you had Josh on the podcast a while ago, and so like things like that are like easy ways to get involved and understand what's going in the ecosystem. But I think largely it's just sort of like jumping in headfirst into and just sort of reading different people's threads, like understanding who you should follow in the space, like just reading different people's writing is the easiest way to go
Mm.
about it. And talking to people in person as well is a really good way of learning. Like I think there's only so much you can read, but if you talk to people in person, online, like in Discord or wherever the community is sort of based, I think that's a really good way of getting involved and learning more about the space. I think it's just like all about practical application. So like if you read about
Yeah.
NFTs, go and buy an NFT. If you read about DeFi, get stuck into a DeFi protocol and just like stake a few tokens and things like that. Like you just have to give it a go. Like it seems pretty daunting, so do it with like a little bit of money, nothing that can ruin you, but like that's how I got started. It was probably early 2017. I just bought a bit of Ethereum, just did a bit of reading, like read the white paper and that sort of thing, and it just like opened a larger world for me to just like keep diving deeper down the rabbit hole, really.
Yeah, cool. That's exciting, and I think I like now. Now it's maturing as a thing slightly. And now there is a lot of those like places where you can kind of get the lowdown, and things have been
Yeah,
explained in more simple terms now than perhaps they were
yeah, for sure.
previously,
Yeah,
which is
I
good.
mean, I think the space is still finding product market fit. Like it's still incredibly early, despite how long it's been
Mm.
around for, like 10 years or like even longer actually for Bitcoin. But yeah, like it's been around for a while, but it's still maturing. It's still growing. It's still really early on in its journey. And so like, even I don't know where it's going to be in like 6 months time. Like no one really knows. We're all learning together, and so it shouldn't, like, hopefully it's not too intimidating for someone to just like come in. One of the good things I think about Web3 is like everyone understands that, and so is always enthusiastic to help more people get in. So like just
Mm.
reach out to me or someone else like that you see who's posting about Web3 or like talking about it, and just ask them for help. Like I'm always willing to help people get involved and finding where they might fit within the whole ecosystem. But yeah, like I think anyone in the space is always willing to help people learn, which is really
Yeah.
awesome.
No, definitely. It's nice to have that in a space for sure. I want to like take this conversation to a bit more of a macro level of yourself and your career. And I'm curious to hear, as someone that's in VC and in all these different areas, are there any people that you really look up to and say that guy does or that guy or girl does something? I really admire them for this thing, or someone that you really want to emulate, and what would be a reason why you'd want to do why you look up to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of people I look up to, and there's a lot of people I have to thank for where I am today as well. And I look up to all of those people. Probably one of the interesting ones, hmm, maybe Josh Wolf again, like so founder of Lux Capital. Like I found his writing ages and ages ago, when I was back at uni. Like, and I was like super fascinated by him as a person. Like the way he writes is like really really clear, and I hope like my writing is like 1% as clear as his. And the
Mm.
way he sort of like speaks on podcasts and in presentations and things is just like incredible. I think he's just got like high level of clarity in his own mind, and then he's also like a really forward thinking person. And so like some of the stuff that Lux do is just incredible. So they incubate sometimes some deep tech companies, they back really amazing companies. And so like that's always just like fascinated me, and like he's been at the forefront of all of that. And so he's someone that really inspires me. Hopefully I can meet him one day, but who knows.
Yeah, yeah, cool. No, I think it's nice to have people like that certainly, and it's interesting that he's kind of been someone that you've looked up to for so long as well. That's really cool. I want to Nat, you've mentioned university, and I'd love to kind of wrap on a question that I ask all the guests, and you can
Yeah,
take this wherever you'd like. But something I ask the guests is kind of if you had to wind back the clock to when you were just finishing uni and starting into the work world, what things do you know now that you
yeah,
wish you knew when you were at that stage?
yeah. I think I'd probably experiment a lot more with what for my career. Like I think what I should have done back then is probably like talk to a lot of people in the ecosystem and figure out like ways to get involved, even if it didn't seem like I'd be able to get involved from the outside. I should have sort of like been a bit more proactive, I think, and talk to people. Like I think I was a little bit daunted by the fact that all of the people back then were just like really experienced people, and I was like, oh, who's going to talk? But I think they probably would have been nice enough to talk to me back then, and so like I probably should have done that. I think there's a lot more opportunities for experimentation, and and I say this from like a privileged point of view as well. Like I think some uni students are really privileged in the fact that they still live at home, they don't have to pay rent, they don't have to pay for food, blah blah blah, and so for them, like they can be pretty like they can take more riskier options in their career. So they can work at different startups for like 2-3 month periods, like intern at different places without really worrying about securing a grad job. But other people also like who aren't as lucky or in a privileged position, for them what I think is really important is like to be able to sort of like secure a grad job initially, um, secure that grad job, and then use that to leverage other opportunities. And so like what I mean by that, and I think this is becoming a bit more accepted now actually, because companies are really desperate for good talent, and so you're able to sort of like negotiate with them your start date. So like push your grad start date back like 6 months or a year or something like that, and in that time go and experiment working for a startup, or go and experiment with doing something that you've always wanted to do. If that's traveling all over the world, like go and do that. If that's sort of like starting your own business, like go and do that. And you've got a bit of security there in that grad job, and you can always like bring that forward. I'm fairly certain, like if you just talk to people, like they're willing to help you out as much as possible. But I think, yeah, like talking to people, experimenting is probably like what I should have done a lot earlier in my career.
Yeah, cool. I think that's great advice. Certainly, having that wide range of perspectives will, yeah, really, really
Yeah,
help and help you to decide and get more of those views and help you decide what you want to do more as well. I think it's
yeah,
so important.
for sure. And I think like people are open to it more now than they were before, and so like
Mm,
why not make use of that opportunity? But yeah,
yeah,
it's a super important thing. It's just like talking to people, experimenting. I think like if you're not sure what you want to do, that's like the best way to learn about what you might not want to do or what you will want to do for the rest of your life.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's so important. And thanks for sharing that today. Where can people go to find out more about yourself? Connect with you.
Yeah, so I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search my name, or you can find me on Twitter as well. But for some of the other stuff, so for Superfluid, I write on Substack. So I think the Substack URL is abhym.substack.com. For DAO Under, you can find us on Twitter. For ETH Down Under, you can find us on Twitter as well. For Brown Baddies, you can find us on Twitter. But yeah, and I guess like for folklore related items, like you can book in office hours with me on our website, or just reach out to Abby at folklore.vc. Like super happy to chat to anyone who wants to chat.
Great. Well, yeah, we'll have all the links to all those places wherever you're watching or listening to this show. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Abby. It's been really fascinating hearing from you and the things that you're involved with. Yeah, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it, and it was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.